Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Carrie Coogan. I'm Deputy Director of the Kansas City Public Library, and if this is your first time here, which I hope it's not your first time, but if it is, please pick up one of our calendars. You can find them as you're walking out, and then you can sign up to get this once a month. It talks about all of our programs that we have both here and downtown at the Central Library all month long, or else you can sign up to get a weekly email, and it will tell you about all the great programs we have coming up. We're so thrilled to have our guest tonight, Helen LaKelly Hunt, the name you might recognize. She is the half-sister of the late Kansas City Chiefs founder and owner Lamar Hunt. But Helen has her own important and impactful story. You may have seen or heard of it, but in the process of researching her dissertation in the Barnard Library, Hunt discovered the primary source manuscript titled "Turning the World Upside Down," the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women held in New York City on May 9th of 1837. The date is important because the men's abolitionist movements had been all white men, and the Seneca Falls Convention was all white women, and the history books tell us that happened in 1848. This was all new information, and Hunt realized that this was a story that really needed to be told. And in her book, which we're going to be talking about tonight, The Spirit Moved Them, The Lost Radical History of America's First Feminists, she gives an up-close and personal rendition of some very little-known history. The very first meeting of feminists in 1937, an Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women in New York City. The window on history, she says, that I opened up in the Barnard Library unsealed a parallel window into my past. The window helped Hunt liberate herself from what was called the golden handcuffs of gender-normed behavior and to accept more fully her power and purpose in building stronger funding networks for women and for girls. It's been her mission ever since. And she says, "I'm grateful to be a part of feminism and to add my labor to such meaningful work." That meaningful work translates into trailblazing the path to seed the women's first funding movement. She co-founded the Dallas Women's Foundation, the New York Women's Foundation, the Women's Funding Network, and Women Moving Millions. Her own private foundation, the Sister Fund, focuses on faith, feminism, and relationship. And Helen was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2001. In addition to all of that, she has co-authored several books with her partner, Harville Hendricks, on relationship therapy. They are now working on a new co-creation called Safe Conversations, and that's structured conversations that allows two people, even if they disagree, to speak with mutual respect for one another. Please help me give a nice, warm welcome to Helen LaKelly Hunt.
Thank you so much. An honor to be here. And the story of these women is so important that I'm just going to dive in because it's lost history, and their pictures are never on PowerPoint screens. They don't hang any place. And I'm really thrilled to be able to show their photos to you and list some of their names, because the people who have learned about a convention that they helped convene agree this was the beginning of American feminism. Ken Burns and other people have said, how many people in the room have heard of Seneca Falls? Would you raise your hand? And that is considered the beginning of American feminism. Ken Burns and many people say that. But there is a story of these women. And it was such an honor to accidentally discover them and be able to share their story with you tonight. Maybe I should mention that I had worked in the field of feminism for a while, but I'd never studied it. I didn't really understand what I was doing. And I had a feeling that women's faith was an important part of feminism, but it wasn't talked about. And I decided to do a dissertation on the religious roots of American feminism. And I checked into a school, started working on a dissertation. I thought I would be on Seneca Falls, and I accidentally discovered this information. And it had to do with the fact that in the 1830s, the United States was about 50 years young. And, but women were troubled by a national hypocrisy. They went, listen, we are really proud that the Constitution is liberty and justice for all. We're proud to be Americans. But why in the world is the institution of slavery growing bigger and bigger every single year? That doesn't seem right. We don't have any proof of this, but we believe that the first 7 or 8 presidents, they really believed in the Constitution. But, well, I think of the first 10 presidents, 8 of them were slaveholders. Now, how can you be the president of a country, liberty and justice for all, and own slaves yourself? And when I've thought about this, there is a belief that these first presidents assumed that slavery would die out, that it wouldn't last long. It would just help kickstart the country. But that did not happen. Pretty soon in the South, especially, the economics was dependent on slavery. And it just began exponentially growing every year. And everyone was sort of looking the other way about it. And they said, listen, we have to do something. And as couples, they decided to come together and discuss forming an American anti-slavery society. We are against slavery, and everyone in the organization will make that statement, and it will grow. And the women, you know how women are, we're good at finding the place for the meetings as it's being discussed. We also bring the food. We do minutes for the meetings, and we're essential to all these meetings happening. And after 3 months, they said, look, we're going to start the organization. So say y'all are the people in the room. They had a table. They did this real clear memo. We are going to be founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So everyone in the room got up and lined into a queue to sign that they were willing to be members. But the women were in the line with the men, and the men were uncomfortable and started, and they said, listen, we love you as wives, your place is at the home, and so we'll be members, and we know your heart's in the right place, but it was all male. And so what were the women to do? There's a document written 20 years later, Samuel May, he said, I shall ever forget the wise, impressive, animated words spoken at the convention by Lucretia Mott and several other women, and the mortifying fact that we were so blind, so obtuse, we would not let these women become members. So that's sort of what the culture was like at that time. Well, these women were, look, we're going to do it another way. You know, we'll start our own. And one had already been started in Salem, and a couple years later there were, 17, and then pretty soon 42. And by 1837, there were 134 female anti-slavery societies. And they were on fire because it was time that the country looked at what they were doing. And they became public agitators. And so that's an early photo of Frederick Douglass with Lucretia and others. So what I want to emphasize is their faith was a major catalyst to them speaking out. They wanted a political voice, but the government said, I am sorry, you are not supposed to vote and you cannot speak in public. Sorry. By the way, the churches said, I'm sorry, your place is at home and you're not allowed to speak, so don't even try. But God's message to them was, shout it out, and the women did. They really got on fire to go ahead. They took their scriptures seriously. I loved finding this little document when S's looked like F's. Women speaking is justified, proved, and allowed of by the scriptures. All such as speak by the Spirit and the power of the Lord Jesus, and how women were the first that preached the tidings of the resurrection. Come on, give us credit. And we were sent by Christ's own command before he ascended to the Father. Stop leaving women out, right? Okay, and I think of these women as religious revolutionaries. And I think of you all as a welcoming committee to welcome these women to their place in history tonight. So thank you for convening to be here. They should not be in the shadows of history. So they decided, after these little local anti-slavery societies and they were exchanging letters and they were inspiring each other, doing all sorts of things, one of them said, let's have a national convention. So first, women are not supposed to go anyplace unescorted. Like, you don't go out, and especially to another place without your man to protect you. But they got on steamboats. They got on in their carriages, and unescorted 174 delegates met in New York City. And so we have a lot of their diaries, and one of them wrote, "Such a convention the world has never saw." They were so proud of themselves, the first national political meeting of U.S. women, and the first interracial gathering of any consequence. Gloria Steinem calls this book The Hidden Figures of American feminism's history, because Seneca Falls was all white women, and it was really a lot of people helped bring about the dignity and voice of women, should be embraced and strengthened. None of the men's abolitionist meetings were diverse. They were all white men only. And I am so proud that these women really wanted, it was called activism with, not for. They were very intentional about the vice presidents of the convention being, well, they were women of color, and everything was done with Native American women and African American women as part of the leadership. Angela Grimke. Okay, this is the first time women declared their right to step into their power in the public. At the convention was very Robert Rules. There was it wasn't exactly called that at the time, but they were very formal. If any of you want to ever get the book or learn about the history, but there was a resolution, the time has come for women to move into that sphere in which Providence has assigned her, and no longer remain satisfied and in the circumscribed limits with which corrupt custom and a perversion application of the system has encircled her. Now, a couple points. Their faith fueled their vision. 27th Psalm, though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then will I be confident. They were constantly sharing scripture like this with one another. And there was a meeting in Boston of the women and men in the room, and a mob formed, and there was a man there, and the mob went in, William Jennings, and they pulled out this man saying, "How dare you be there in a meeting with women, and I don't like what you're doing." And the police came, and one woman's diary said, "Listen, this is a cause worth dying for. Just go ahead and take my life. I'm ready to go." Esther was their role model. And the second thing that was special about the way these women worked was the relational dynamic, where they so wanted to be attuned to how they spoke out against slavery, not just the fact they were doing so. And one of the things at the convention that they realized is when they meet in public, everyone's upset, and they can't vote, and they can't preach it from the pulpit, and what do? They can petition. The right to petition is natural, inalienable, derived immediately from God. You see how they ground their decisions in cosmic truth, universal truth. And so they decided to knock on each other's doors, go into neighborhoods, meet people, and get people to sign their petitions. I read about one thing, they knocked on the door, "Hi, we're collecting signatures for people who feel that slavery should be abolished. Can we come in and talk to you about it?" And the woman answering the door goes, is there slavery in the country? And they said, "Yes, we want to tell you about what it's like for these families, these African-American families in the South. They're just treated like animals." And they didn't have radio. They didn't have TV. They didn't know what was going on in the South. So they really formed all these relationships, and they began to send the petitions to the government. And the senators, of course, all white people in Congress, got sick and tired of there were apparently, supposedly, tables in Congress, and they kept stacking the petitions, and they got really sick and tired of them, and they passed the pick-me-gag rule, telling the women, "Don't even bother to send them, we're not going to read them." And they ended up burning them. The third thing about their organizing was they practiced empathy. Women there wasn't a Target or a Walmart or anything. They didn't have stores, and they were constantly darning socks and fixing. There were sewing circles throughout New England. And this woman had the idea of, at sewing circles throughout the Northeast, if women, as they sewed, one person could stand and read a slave narrative while the other women were sewing, darning socks or hemming dresses or whatever. And the slave narrative would remind women what it's like for a woman to be on an auction block, and there she is. Her husband's being bought in one plantation, her kids are being sold at another plantation, and she's assigned to a third. And Margaret would help the women understand how cruel it is, for so many reasons, that people of color in the South are just treated like objects instead of people. So I don't have time to read this, but it was just a brilliant idea. And they thought their efforts would be applauded, because guess what? They got the attention of Congress. At least they got banned, like somebody noticed, and and also they were creating energy, but they decided to meet a year later, and instead of New York, they met the same women in Philadelphia. And this is Pennsylvania Hall, the same president, vice president, chair, treasurer, the same protocol. It's amazingly formal, and they're talking about taking their desire to speak out against slavery to the next stage. And a mob surrounded the building. And that wasn't planned. And the mob started throwing stones into the window, and the window would break. And then they would throw pieces of wood inside. And the women were writing diaries about, look what's happening. So we have all these diaries about what happened. And they started shouting, go home. We don't want you here in Philadelphia. They were yelling and screaming. And the women couldn't hear each other talk. So with it getting, and they had torches. And with it getting so heated, they decided, okay, Lucretia Mott stood up and said, all right, link arm in arm, black and white women together. Let's open the door and just walk out into the mob, because we can't even continue with our convention. So they opened the door, they walked out into the mob, and the mob set the building on fire. And there were people at the time that drew photos of what happened. So they were just traumatized by the culture. That's how threatening it was for women's voices to be out. And what was sad is they met again a third year, and it was only half the size of the others. And then that was the last meeting. It was backlash, and after, it was just hard on the women to keep meeting. But Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, wrote, when the true history of the anti-slavery cause should be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages, for the cause of the slave has been particularly women's cause. Her heart and her conscience have supplied in large degree its motive and mainspring. It was her skill and industry, patience and perseverance that has been wonderfully manifest in this very trial hour, in every trial hour. So many people recognized the importance of what these women did, how courageous they were, and how their faith inspired them. They had no choice but to take action, even if they were going to die. A very famous meeting happened in London in 1840, and they decided to make a world anti-slavery convention, because the anti-slavery societies in the United States, there are a whole lot of letters to anti-slavery societies of women that were going on, and men, in London and back and forth. Like, it was a transcontinental, did I say that right? Interatlantic, anyway, across the ocean. It was their work in the Northeast was really a global work of two continents. And so someone planned this convention, and the women with the men, their husbands, got on the boats and came across the ocean. And they were sitting there, they were so excited to be present at this meeting. And it was a 3-day meeting, and the records have it the whole first day there was a debate on whether or not the women should be allowed to be sitting in the convention hall. And the decision was made that tomorrow the convention would start, but the women had to sit in the balcony behind a veil. And Frederick Douglass was on the floor, but he went up and sat in solidarity the last 2 days of the convention. because he didn't think women should be excluded like that. So that's what it's been like, as maybe we know, but this reminds us. So what's the takeaway? When I was doing my dissertation, they went, wow, Helen, you found this history. Feminism is real different now. There was first wave feminism, which was let's get the vote. Second wave feminism was also to protest. But the third wave, what's the third wave of feminism going to be like? And my dissertation advisor says, really, the work for women of these abolitionist feminists were almost like a blueprint for what's needed today. That women ought to work more relationally when they're speaking about the importance of women's rights. And we should include our faith. And if that has meaning to us, and mine does me, we should talk about our faith as feminists. And empathy. We ought to work, not just, I want my rights, that does have a place, but also just move into love. Like, I just realized I don't have a PowerPoint slide about that. What if women wielded love to bring about dignity and justice for all? Yeah. Thank you. I mean, we're great at love, and there's a blueprint for what it means to be a feminist, and maybe that's not the total thing, that in this next era, we can talk about how can love for one another. Like, let's talk about love. Rebecca Walker is Alice Walker's daughter, and she helped found third wave feminism, and she and I have worked together a little bit, and she is saying this, I'm quoting her a lot, about the emphasis on empathy for one another. At one point, women and men were fused. Why do women need the vote? If a man goes to the poll, he's representing his wife, so women don't need, and that's what Harville's a relationship expert, and by the way, he helped me a lot with the dissertation and the book. But we think of relationships as, if you're in a kind of relationship where you're fused symbiotically, like, I think this way, don't you? Doesn't everybody? And they stand at the altar, you and I are one, but I'm the one. You know, that's called symbiosis, and that's really phase one of most relationships, but in the culture. By the way, how am I doing with time? Until I'm supposed to be finished? Okay. 5 minutes, okay. And it's sort of natural to think, you know, I have opinions, and what's your name? Yeah, Sarah? Well, don't you think the way I think? I mean, probably. Well, anyway, you have to be limited on how it really is good to be curious and wonder and da-da. But anyway, people are fused and movements fuse. You have to do it just like, but for relationships to be healthy, people have to differentiate. And this is what Harville and I do in our workshops and our work with couples. You have to differentiate and give someone else the right to have their point of view, and then you can connect in a healthy way. So there's wisdom about how we can all learn to be more respectful of everyone and have your own point of view. But I mean, we're all struggling and we're all doing the best we can. We think third wave feminism is, it is up there, the practice of love and empathy. Imagine. So I love that idea. I'd love to know if any of y'all have thoughts about what that might be. We think, Harville and I love working together. So many men are feminists, and we love that men and boys are a part of the women's movement or working in behalf of women. We think healthy relationships can result in a healthy culture and a healthy world. And so thank you so much for being present tonight as I've gotten to show you these women's faces, and I just feel like, again, this is a moment of bringing them out of the shadows of history, and we have a lot to learn from their wisdom. I am so grateful that the women from the Kansas City Women's Foundation are here, and yay! Would you stand, anyone? And I'd love to learn about what y'all are doing these days. And I think this is a time we can move into Q&A. Does that make sense? Whoever's in charge.
If you have a question, if you would, please use the microphones down here so that the folks in the audience can hear your question as well as Helen's answer. And while we wait on that, Helen, I wonder, you said you weren't going to tell this story tonight, but you told it earlier about the Ken Burns documentary. Would you be opposed to sharing that with the audience?
Oh, okay. So I was invited to give this someplace else. And when I went home, I was just really depressed. How could these women have been left out of history for so long? I don't get it. And what I really didn't like is I have great respect for Ken Burns. How many people know who Ken Burns is and respect him? Isn't he amazing? He is awesome. And I had seen before a documentary he did. It was called Elizabeth and Susan. Elizabeth Cady Stanton convened the Seneca Falls Convention with 4 other women, and they catalyzed the first convention where women declared they had the right to vote. And pretty soon, Susan Anthony came on the scene, and Susan was indefatigable, as you all know, working with Elizabeth about women deserve the right to vote. Women are citizens, and we pay taxes, and with paying taxes, we should get the vote. And I had seen that documentary because I'm interested in history. I love libraries. This is such a cool library, right? Yay for the library. History is very important. But I thought, Harville, I think when I saw that documentary, do you think it was ever stated that was the origin of American feminism? Because they left out this, and I want to see the documentary again. So we turned it on and watched it, and I could not believe the number of people said Seneca Falls was the origin of American feminism. They quoted all these people, and I just didn't like how certain they were about it. I was mad and I was sad and I started crying. And I decided, I don't do this very often, but she always answers when I do. I decided to call Gloria Steinem. I said, Gloria, I just can't believe it. I've just rewatched the Ken Burns documentary. And Ken insists this is the origin of American feminism, and then these feminist scholars do too. It's just so heartbreaking. I don't know what to do. And she said, oh, Helen, it's frustrating. Ken has his facts wrong at times. He's not great with history. I went, really? I didn't realize that. And she said, oh, yes, and he needs another haircut. Maybe someone could give him feedback. So we talked about approaching Ken, but I never have. So that's the story, and really looking forward to hearing any comments that anyone in the room has.
It seems to me that there are a lot of women, particularly young women these days, who are coming forth and organizing, particularly in the areas of women's rights and abuse around the world, and also climate change. So if I'm assuming that these women do not know about this earliest convention, how do you see what they're doing now as an outgrowth of what these women started?
Great question. So what's happening now around climate change and these other things is they really are working in a diverse way. So that's one way. That Harville and I are working in the field of the relational sciences, and I have a lot of respect for some of the other relationship scientists who talk about it's our relationship with each other, but also the relationship with the earth. And how attuned are we to the fact that the toxicity that's hurting the earth. And so did that respond to your question, Nini? Okay. I can't think of a better answer. I'm so sorry. So I will just, maybe, can I take your question to be a statement of that you hope what they did lives on today? Is that what okay. That you're hoping that even if there are all these other issues, that women's dignity is a part. Is that right? A little bit? Okay, thank you very much. So this gentleman and then here.
Thank you for coming. My question is more about the ERA amendment and why has it taken so long to get it passed when, back when they had abolished slavery and everything, they did it with a snap of a finger.
Thank you. That's not, it looks like a question, but that's a statement. It's just horrific. And I know. It's so tragic. It came so close, and it didn't, and it should have, and I do not know why. I don't know. Obviously, the opposition was strong enough to keep it from passing. So far. That doesn't mean that this next year, on the suffrage centennial, we can maybe revive it. I'm actually working with someone in Dallas, where we live, who wants to do that. That makes next 2020 a time to get the ERA passed. So thank you for mentioning that.
Hi, and I'm so glad to hear you here. I just recently read the beginning of biography because I was working on a speech. I taught American history. And as I remember, there was something like a small women's revolution during the time of the revolution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then it came off, and I knew about the Grimkes and the Wells and Lucretia Mott. And in looking at the 1848 Seneca Falls thing, it seems to me that while there was a women's rights movement going on, and maybe you know from your research whether that was the time when, I know that the first of the declarations of sentiments, both the first two were on the right for women to vote. And that Frederick Douglass was there. Also, there were men at that too, according to what but that he was the one that swung them over so that that was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's point, that women had not been able to, it's taxation without representation kind of thing. But if it would be fair to say, or if you know anything about when it was that they started the right for women to vote, in addition to the women's rights movements for property rights and being able to have your children in a divorce and all that sort of thing.
I'm not sure I'm getting your question 100%.
Well, it's sort of
It almost feels like there are a couple, but let me make this point.
Okay.
What a lot of people said, even the women themselves, when the feminist abolitionists stepped up and said, that's not right, you can't treat the slaves in the South the way you are. They began to be in touch with their own slavery, the way they were slaves, and that working in behalf of the others, they began to go, I feel that, I'm not treated respectfully.
Right, and I know one of our local heroes, Clarina Nichols, who did in her speech say that, and they very often compared the plight of women to the plight of slavery, that they were basically slaves themselves.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question was, if you knew when it was that the the women's rights to vote movement started, because I was kind of taken aback that Seneca Falls was a right of feminism. I think it's more like women's rights and maybe the right to vote. So I was just asking on what kind of information you might have. And I'm also with the League of Women Voters.
Okay, all right. Elizabeth and her group, it was about voting.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the purpose.
Afterwards, after abolition, after the Civil War, yeah. Okay, I'll let somebody else
But
talk.
again, they said, are we citizens?
Yeah.
Are women citizens? Or are we slaves? I mean, we pay taxes, but we can't vote. So they were in no man's land, if you will.
It was a Missouri woman that got that established in the Supreme Court, Virginia Minor. She tried to register in 1872 and was refused, and her husband. And they said, yes, you are citizens. You're freeborn, you're white, you're 21. But voting is not an inalienable right of citizenship. So it's determined by legislature.
Right. And in the first slide, there was a woman named Abby Kelly.
Yeah.
And a lot of women showed up trying to vote as a protest, and they were declined. And I forget the radical things they did. I'm sort of forgetting. What are you doing in 2 weeks? Would you like to make a speech? Would you like to?
Actually, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be at my son's home in Pleasanton, California.
Okay, well, maybe someday. I bet you would make a wonderful speech. Thank you.
Hi. So we just co-founded the first women's empowerment club at our school, and so I was just wondering, how can we make people feel less like feminism is a threat, because currently there's a connotation that feminism is kind of like extremist, or that like we're more superior than men, but it's more about equality. So I was wondering how we could reduce that connotation currently.
What is your first name?
Joanna.
Joanna?
Yeah.
Should we all give her applause?
And I co-founded it with my best friend, Gracie.
And your first name is what?
Gracie.
Gracie? Okay. So I'm really not wise enough to have an answer, but it's I think a rhetorical statement that wouldn't it be great if there were 10 of these clubs at every school, and you all are the visionaries and on the cutting edge.
Well,
So
thank you.
I join everyone in this room to say thank you for making this an important issue.
So I kind of had a question building upon that. So my question was, like, how can we manifest the feminist movement through our relationships with other women?
One of my favorite days in my whole life was getting arrested. I mean, we shouldn't just be at home talking. A quick story. I was talking to someone 15 years ago, maybe it's longer, and they said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you the truth. She just met me, and I said, I've had a lot of ups and downs in my life. I've had a couple decades where I really was screwed up a lot, but these days I'm so happy. I love my life. I am very happy. There's only one thing I've wanted in my life, and I haven't gotten it done, but everything else is bringing me joy." And they said, "Well, what's that thing?" And I said, "I've never gotten arrested." And they said, "What?" And I said, "It's a democracy. If you believe in something, why aren't you out there? Like don't talk about it at home, get arrested." And someone at the table said, "Oh, I can fix that. I know how to tell people how to get arrested." So she did. Has anyone heard of Sojourners? Okay. So she was at Sojourners. So it was the 5th anniversary of the Iraqi War. And if you wanted to bring the soldiers home, they had a convening where you showed up in the White House, you sang hymns, you knelt and prayed where you aren't supposed to, pedestrians aren't supposed to be there. And it was icy, it was all night, it was like, and police kept coming. "I'm sorry, you have to move, that's illegal to be praying there." And finally, they teach us how, finally the police car came and they put handcuffs on me and they started dragging me into the police thing, and they said, "You have to go, 'They're taking me away, they're taking me away.'" You have to make it really loud. At the police station, I was handprinted, fingerprinted, and I was released the next morning. I have a police record. Like, go out, make your voices heard.
Thank you. Those are great answers.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. I've a lot, like you said, that is not known. And I was particularly interested in the makeup of the group, the fact that it was Black women and white women, and that's that piece of the lost history. I'm curious, in your research or just your personal opinions, how did we get from there in the 1830s to not only, as you mentioned, Seneca Falls being white women, but also, as you know, quite a bit of conflict coming up, and really a sense that a lot of white feminists very much abandoned the civil rights movement, in pursuit of their own goals, or were willing to turn their backs on
And sadly, Elizabeth and Susan did. That the men, African American men and women, had stood with Susan and Elizabeth in group, and when the government said, "Okay, we'll let women have the vote, but not men," African Americans, let the women have the vote, but not African Americans. I think it's the biggest shame in the world that Susan and Elizabeth agreed, and they said, "Well, this is women's hour." And see, that's the earliest feminists wouldn't have done that. They would have waited until everyone in the country has the right to vote.
Too bad we lost that thread during those decades somehow.
Yeah, thank you for letting us speak about that.
That's not my question, but
go ahead, please.
But my understanding is that the women took a back seat so that the blacks could get the right to vote first.
That's not my... So if I've got it right, you're saying that the women took the back seat so that African Americans get the vote first?
Yes, right after the Civil War.
I think that my recollection of the history is different.
Women didn't get the right to vote till 1920.
Right.
Blacks got the right to vote pretty close after the Civil War.
Okay.
And women said, "Okay, we'll do that, and then it'll be our turn."
Okay. I haven't done this talk in a while.
But my question... Well, they got behind her. Well, you know who won.
They did not sit back. Some of them sit back.
Some of them said, we'll do this first, and then our turn will come. But
So I really want to apologize. I'm actually not a historian scholar. What I'm really good at is relationship science with my husband Harville. So if I said, I think 99.9% of what I've said is accurate, but I'm not, if I said anything.
There may have been that split, but there was a large movement that said, okay, you know, slavery was bad and the blacks deserve the right to vote, and our turn will come after it. And that was the one that won out, whether there was a split or not. But my question is not, the women got a right to vote, and it still took more time for them to get their economic and social freedom.
Right.
But what I'm worried about today is women's health freedom, the right to control their own body.
Right.
And so I was asking you where you see that going, because in the United States we're going backwards. Europe is not at all.
Oh,
like
it's
this.
horrible what's happening around women's health. One thing that I appreciate about the Kansas City Women's Fund is they've even started an initiative to get women appointed in political office or in positions of power, where typically men made decisions around women's health and other things. And making sure thoughtful women are making decisions about women's health, you know, we have to work in that political realm. And I think anyone at in the Kansas City Women's Foundation could tell you about that. I think all of us should get involved in what the Kansas City Women's Fund is doing about. It's not about funding women only. It's also lifting up the women's voice in political power.
Do you have any documentation of how this movement affected women's personal lives and relationships and family lives, and what their husbands and fathers and brothers, all of those kind of people, thought about them doing this?
I think there's not a one way that the women felt about it, but the majority of the people that I read, the women, I think, knew they were called. That.
How did that affect their family, though?
I think in many cases their family was inspired, and there were a lot of men that did. A lot of these women had husbands who knew how important this was.
Thank you.
So I think in general they just knew that life is flawed and the country is flawed, and it's very exciting to become a part of a movement. It's energizing, and it may not even ultimately succeed, but you've tried. And I think they know their kids are proud of them for trying. So that's a really thoughtful question. Thank you.